Welcome to lesson 4 of the full course, How to Win Architecture Competitions. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the proposal in section and elevation, focusing on how it sits within the site and responds to the slope. Inside Rayon, I'll walk you through the process of producing sections and elevations and how to populate them using the same blocks as the floor plan, which includes the alternative block views that are suited for different orthographic drawings. You're welcome to follow along with the class by creating a free Rayon account using the link below or jumping into the template from the description. Okay, yes, so now we're going to shift our focus from the floor plan now to the sections and elevations. We're first going to focus on the elevations, which are going to focus on these two main elevations. We're going to call them the north and east elevation, let's say. So the north being this top one here, the east one being this one, kind of looking at the building in parallel with the slope. And we'll really start identifying and understanding how this is going to work into the landscape of the slope, how it's going to start actually having some kind of level changes and how it's going to step up and step down. So now to introduce how we can set up different types of drawings within the same workspace, you have these canvases at the top left corner here. So what you want to do to create a new canvas, a new model canvas to start producing your drawings, you want to head up to the top here. You can then do paper or model canvas. We want to do model canvas, so you'd click model canvas here, which I've already set up here in this sections tab. If you select into there, you will then have your kind of next set of drawings that you can then start working into. And then when you're working in your paper canvas, you can then link in those drawings from those model canvases in there. So it's all kind of working in one space, in one workplace. So we currently have our section line set up at the moment to show the kind of topography and the level changes across the landscape. These will all start making more sense in a moment as I start bringing in views into the floor plan. So these two are going to be our two elevations. So this is the long elevation looking onto the slope, and then this is the side looking into the building as it integrates into the landscape. And then these are going to be our two sections. So the first thing that we're going to do, which is going to be the best way for us to start drawing our elevations, is going to be to create a view into our floor plan. And then we can rotate and organize that floor plan. So then we can start drawing some lines and some guidelines in order for us to start structuring the elevation. So what we're going to do is head over to the left hand side here where it says layers. We're going to click new, we're going to click view, and then you can choose which model canvas or paper canvas you want to put a view into. In this case, we want to do a plan. Now what it's done here is it's creating a view into that plan, which you can then scale up and scale down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it so that essentially this is going to be parallel with the landscape. And in fact, we're going to make that 1:1 so that it's the right scale. You can then crop this down to the scale that we want. And then we want to make sure that this is directly parallel. So what we can do is head over to the bottom here where it says shapes. You can click guidelines, which is also G. And you'll see that you'll get these guidelines in either vertical or horizontal. You could also do diagonal. But for this case, we're going to do a horizontal guideline. And this will basically just give us our kind of base point for rotating this view. Rotate that to the grid. And then now we know that that is parallel to the drawing. Now in the same way, we're then going to use the guidelines in the vertical way. And this is where you can start pulling down some of your geometry and start basically aligning some of those walls. So those lines will then essentially start dictating basically the structure of our elevation. So now we have these two views set up, both parallel to the views that we want to create. Now the next thing we're going to do is create a new layer, and I'm going to call it mass. So this is just basically going to help us define some of these block zones where we have the level changes and where the form is going to start generate in elevation. The language that I want to create with this space is that I want this kind of long monolithic element of these kind of workshop spaces with this kind of bookend element that might be slightly taller or slightly lower, that kind of cuts off at an angle. But this main gallery center space maybe being quite a significantly taller piece of a kind of taller geometry, which then breaks that monolithic nature and that it kind of steps up and steps down. So I'm just going to use very simply a rectangle here with a solid and make that stroke maybe 30. And then what we're going to start doing is almost just start structuring some of these geometries and get some of the heights right. So currently you can see here that as you push and pull this, you will get certain heights. So if we change the width and height, we'll change the height to maybe Let's make it a 10-meter tall building. And then basically what we want to do is then just start maybe copying some of these elements. Maybe that then does step down. We want to create this kind of long monolithic piece that really does embed into the landscape along here. Maybe we'll pull that to that piece there to line up the top there. Maybe that steps up a bit so the landscape kind of comes down in front. This is your main double height space. This is your entrance space with some kind of steps up. And then let's just pull this element across. So you've got maybe this steps back down again. And now if we wanted then to pull that across into this elevation, we're going to use the grid lines again. So we're going to head down to the grid lines. We're going to do horizontal ones. So then we can start identifying the heights across the other way, like so. And then we can copy some of these geometries over. And with a bit of work, you'll arrive at something like this, which identifies some of the massing. So we've got this element that's kind of stepping up, quite clearly, element stepping up, this central piece. And then in this view, you can see that the kind of gallery definitely pokes out further, which is obviously being shown here. And then it steps back where you have these kind of stepping elements, these stepping geometries. You've got the terrace, you've got the cafe, then you've got the theatre, maybe as that steps up to the higher level, where you could potentially have people accessing this roof terrace at the top. So that's really kind of guiding our massing and our heights. So we have quite tall spaces, which is the kind of type of spaces that I want to create for this. You want it to be quite grand. You want it to be quite an experience and atmosphere as you enter these spaces, particularly in the gallery. And then what we're going to do now is start using some lines. So we're going to create a new line, call it lines, and start working into this with some detail on some of the geometry and some of the actual form that we've kind of identified here in the floor plan. The first one going to be the steps. So I'm going to start drawing the steps. So if I then identify the corner of the steps, which is roughly about there, let's then do a line. And we're going to offset up this by, let's say, 0.2 mil. And maybe it actually comes down into the slope a bit. So let's just copy that down. So maybe something like this, where we've got the main steps up and then we've got the smaller steps down at the back here. And that needs to extend out. And maybe in this case, that could potentially slope down to a lower level. So we've now got like this kind of point of entry, and the forms are starting to kind of come together. And then if we come over to the left hand side here and start adding some of the detail of these windows, the best way to do that, head to the left side, go up to your plan, grab that element, copy that across, paste it in place. Now this is the real beauty of copying across blocks, doors, windows, openings, furniture, people, etc., is that you've got all of these alternative views that you can then switch between in your model. So if we head over to the right hand side here and we change that to the front view, you will see that you'll have that element that you've drawn in plan that is now available in elevation, which is really handy. And then we can rotate that to make sure that it's parallel, and then we can bring that into place. In this particular element, we can extend and add more windows, and you can also still double click into it and you can start making changes and edits to that block to something like this, where we can then start adjusting some of this massing. And further down the line, what we can do is also start drawing in the contour line a little bit better, so that the building's almost kind of embedding further into the landscape. But that is an element of showing you how you can then take those blocks, and I'll show you in much more detail with the furniture and the people as well, and how that works really well. Now I'm going to jump ahead slightly to show you the detail that I'm going to add to this elevation. I'm going to talk through the design language. So to jump ahead, this is what we've arrived at for the elevation. And you can see here now how this language is starting to work really well into the landscape. Identifying once again this kind of monolithic element that kind of extends out into the landscape when you've got this central piece that kind of breaks that rhythm slightly, with then these elements that are kind of stepping down into the landscape. Now, one thing that I wanted to do also was integrate these kind of vertical fins. So there'll be fins that provide this kind of rhythm and language to the facade, kind of going back to some of those early mood board images that I found where the louvers and fins work really well to provide that kind of breakdown on the facade. And although you've got this kind of long monolithic element of forms essentially that are continuing into the landscape, the fins provide a different level of rhythm and a different geometry to break up that language slightly. And then you can see here, then we've got some kind of vertical windows poking into the gallery space. Once again, because of the gallery space being such a key space to control lighting and to make sure that we're not over providing direct sunlight into and onto artwork, we want to make sure that we can manage that. So we'll have roof lighting instead, and then you'll have these kind of open windows to create these kind of pockets of viewpoints, both into the gallery but also out the gallery across the landscape. And as I mentioned in the last lesson with the entrance space, this works really well, I think, with the kind of tall vertical doors where it provides that kind of language into the space and that kind of that entrance point. So we've got this kind of stairway and the geometry that is leading into this entrance space, with then a window at the top of that stair that's giving views into the gallery. So as you arrive at this point here, you can really see into the gallery, and it provides that permeability and also that kind of welcoming feel of into the space, and you can really see into the activity and what's going on in there. And then this lower bit here kind of ramps down slightly. So you've kind of got this stepped up language. And when we come into the section, I'll show you these kind of three levels. You've got this lower level here, you've got this ground level, and then you'll have an upper level up here. But you can see here how this kind of steps down into the landscape at the bottom end here. And then this is your lift at the top here that is going to access this upper level. And then this is kind of like a balustrade. It'll be like a glass balustrade that will wrap around the top. So it's quite a subtle piece. And that will also mean that people can kind of stand up here from the landscape above. So if they're doing walks up this upper level here, they can almost stand on top of the roof here, which is accessed internally as well from this lift that goes up. And then on the side elevation, you can really then start to see how this geometry extends out and provides this real focal point for the design. So where here it kind of sits quite nicely into the landscape, you can see here how it's kind of extending out this element here that's curving. And on the curve, we have that vertical window. You then got those picture windows that I was talking about from the ground floor looking into the gallery. And then you've got these elements, obviously, that's stepping up. You've got the terrace. You've got this kind of feature type wall here that's kind of just bookending that geometry, providing a bit of privacy to the cafe at this angle. And then you've got this vertical window looking into the cafe space here. And then once again, this high level window that is looking into the cafe and the space here into the kind of atrium. And with the lift and then the access, as you can see here, from this upper level. And when we go into styling the drawings, I'll talk a bit more about materiality and how we're going to communicate that materiality in lesson 5. And I'll show you how the kind of materials that we're talking about here and the materials that we're thinking of and how that will really embed into the landscape and how that will kind of come across. So now we're going to jump into the sections. And so as you can see here, I've aligned them with this floor plan and this floor plan here. So we've already kind of got them set up. And the beauty of having the elevations and sections in the same model space, in the same model canvas, is that you'll be able to draw lines across them to make sure that your heights of the massing are all kind of similar and correct across. And in many instances, I'll probably copy down some of these elements and components to make sure that we've got the kind of correct heights across the mass. And in this case, we're looking at a long and short section along the two main axes of the building. The sections are particularly important here because they will clearly reveal the relationship between the internal spaces, external ground levels, and the surrounding landscape. And so you'll see here how now the level will change as you go up the building. What we're going to do here is going to head down to the bottom again. We're going to use the guidelines once again and start selecting these components and the points at where we're cutting through for the section. So the section line's coming through here, and we just want to make sure that we're selecting those elements coming down. So we're cutting through these walls. So what we've identified there are essentially all of our walls, and where we're going to be cutting through a wall and where we want to show almost a black solid wall. Now, very similar in the last lesson where we talked about in floor plan, Going to head over to the right hand side here. We're going to do a style panel. I'm going to change the wall thicknesses to the same as what we did in the floor plan, which you can then very conveniently just flick to the floor plan. You can go in here and you can select whatever that was. So it's a 0.3, and then we can start drawing our walls. So you'll be able to see here that we can start drawing them. And just very crudely, I'm just going to start copying them across, and I will start editing them in a minute. Now we have those kind of elements defined. What I'm now going to do is take this slope and start identifying these level changes. So I'm going to actually copy some of these elements here. So if we know that this is kind of like our ground level that's coming across here. In fact, I'm just going to draw that as a solid line to identify our ground level. We then have this lower ground level, and I'll draw these in a minute with proper FFLs. And then I would suggest that our then upper ground level is probably this one here. So we've got these kind of intermediate level changes as we go up, but to fundamentally identify the three levels, that's what we're looking at, those three. Now, the way that I'm going to do this now is I'm basically going to copy across. I'm going to select those items. I'm going to then select the geometry so that we have an idea of where the kind of roof is going to land. In fact, I'm not going to select the ground bit, but I'm going to select the roof along here. So we then have our kind of heights, our floor to ceiling heights in section. And then I'm going to copy that down to roughly the height that we want. So to draw the floors, I'm going to use the wall again. Got a new floor item, and then going to draw that. So that's our main ground floor. I'm going to just clear the grids and draw a new grid to identify almost where that level starts to change. So at the point of the section line, it changes there. And that's where it steps down to the lower point. And then roughly there is where it then steps back up into this zone here. That's our two ground and lower ground levels. So this is fundamentally the level changes. So the rooms that are stepping down, and then we can pull these down with us so that you can see then how fundamentally each workshop is almost stepping up to a higher level, which we're then going to call the FFL, the upper ground floor level FFL. Now, in order to draw the FFL levels, we can head over to the blocks and we can just call it level. So if we type in level, in fact, we'll go over to the level library. You can see here we've got the elevation line, which we can copy in. I'm just going to pull that into space. Now, what you can do, you can either then go in and edit that block, or you can right click it and do unblock and then make your own changes to it. So I'm going to call it something like, we're going to call the ground level pull that into place. And fundamentally that will then need to extend across. That's then there. So that there is our ground level. And then we'll do the same when we copy up and down to the lower ground level. So we've got here, we've got an upper ground, we've got a ground level, and then we've got a lower ground level. So that's our level changes. That's where the building is stepping up and stepping down. And that'll be really key to identifying this in section. Now I'm just going to spend a bit of time drawing in some of the ceilings. That will follow along there. That will follow along there. And if we use once again our kind of grid lines, we can then see that it almost steps up at that point. So we're then going to copy that up. So we have a very generous, if we just dimension that, very generous 6.5 meter height, floor to ceiling height space for the gallery, which is a really, really great space. And it will step down here at this other end to this lower cafe level. And so just to quickly fast forward to some of the detail that I've added into these spaces, giving it a bit of a perspective So the way that, just to give it a bit of perspective, I've given it like an angle. I've added in the windows now to show this window here. I've identified a reception desk with a kind of mid-height partition with a window up this high level here with some gallery space here, as shown all in the floor plan. But this is just fast forwarding, copying some of these elements down, obviously as that is kind of cut behind that section line, so you'll be able to see that element. And just using the kind of detail lines, I've drawn in some of the elements. And now that we've got at this point, we can then select these two walls and we can trim that down, so then we don't need to see that slicing through anymore. And now the section's starting to come to life a bit. You can now obviously quite clearly see these workshop spaces. You can see the central gallery space. You can see the reception stepping down into the cafe. And something that I'm adding to these sections are these kind of small roof lights, which you'll see much more clearly in the other section. And you'll be able to see how this is coming a bit of like an architectural feature to the section. And to jump ahead to this section here, showing you how we've embedded it into the landscape. You can see here with the form that we've created, based on where we're cutting through at this point here, you can see that we've got this kind of storage space with the storage unit here. You can then see the two kind of adjacent corridors. You can see the workspace here that is embedded into the landscape, and I've created this angled roof line to give it this kind of expansive, extending feeling going into the landscape, with these fins that are bolted onto the external facade with your kind of curtain walling that is running along the facade. And you can see here, once again with the perspective, you can see that we've got these kind of roof light features that will look quite nice, particularly on the roof plan, and also when you're kind of accessing at this upper level with the landscape. So you can see quite clearly how we've integrated this. We've embedded the geometry into the landscape. Now, once again, I'm going to show you how to use the block library to really bring these drawings to life, adding furniture, adding people, adding activity, trees, context, etc. And the block library, once again, will be really effective to show the alternative views. So you can see the plan, the front elevation, side elevation, and here focus on selecting blocks that include multiple orthographic views, ensuring that consistency between the drawings and elevations, and aligning them across the drawings will be really helpful to maintain clarity and consistency and accuracy throughout the drawing set. So what I'm going to do to start copying some of these pieces of furniture into the drawing, I'm going to, for example, I'm just going to take maybe one of these workshops as an example. I'm going to select some of these items, like the 3D printer, for example, maybe some of these worktops, some of the stools, some of the people, maybe some of these bookshelves. I'm going to copy that across and I'm going to paste that in place. So now we have basically the organization of that furniture already set and in place. And so I'm just going to make sure that that's running parallel. I'm going to line that up, rotate it. And so then using, once again, the guidelines, the vertical guideline, I can just pick a corner where that will line up. So that's where almost the furniture will be located directly, perfectly in place in a section. And then I can almost just start selecting these items and changing them to the side elevation, rotating them and dropping them into place. And this will just be a bit of time of making sure that they're all in the correct location. For example, I can then change this to the side wood station, make sure that's rotated and flipped correctly. I can then do the same with some of these swivel stools. And this person sat down. You can see when you go to the side view, this is a really great block to use. And this once again shows the power of being able to have these orthographic blocks where you have all of these different views and you can almost perfectly replicate your floor plan in section and elevation. You can see here the bookshelf, we can then move down to make sure that it aligns. And then you can of course move that, then right click it, do arrange, send to back of layer. So then it's behind those elements, and you can scale up certain items if you think they're too small. And you'll spend a bit of time doing this once again in this section to bring this section alive. To arrive at something like this, where we've basically just taken all of the blocks from that floor plan, copied them over into the elevation, and started populating these elements. So you can see here that we've got these kind of work stations. We've got all like the shelving units and all of the items that we need from the floor plan. Really brings this drawing to life. I think this works really well. And you can see the level of detail in some of these blocks is fantastic. And I've added in some kind of gallery spaces where we could potentially add some artwork in when we come to stylizing the drawings. So you can start seeing then the gallery space, you can start seeing the lifts. So we even have lifts that we can drop into place. We've got all the kind of the bookshelves and stuff for the shop. And then you've got kind of high level bar stools as shown in the floor plan. Like these here with people sat having a coffee. And we all have all that level of detail now in the drawing. And the same with this section here. You can start seeing some of the heights of these spaces and how grand and hopefully beautiful these spaces will be creating with lights penetrating into the rooms. These fins will create really nice kind of angles for lighting and viewpoints. And you can see here that it works really well with the storage room. And the detail of the blocks just really add that life to the drawings. You can then do the same with the people. Have people sat down and people kind of showing the activity. This little kid looking into the room to also indicate that scale. People walking dogs in elevation. Once again, all of the kind of activities, people walking through the gallery spaces, walking down into the cafe area. Someone stood having a coffee, and just adding that activity. Likewise with the trees that you can add in the foreground and background. And once again, adjusting the opacity as talked about in the previous lesson. To show you how to do that, you can double click into the item. You can then change some of these elements. So I've dropped the opacity of the line and the stroke around the tree down to 30%. You can then change and adjust some of these internal details down to 10%. So it looks really soft and elegant, but you have this kind of overlapping nature and detail to the drawing that really just adds a real strong graphic element. You've got obviously cars in elevation, you've got all the people and the chairs and benches. And then the way to put kind of trees in the background is that by managing your layers, you can then draw a kind of fill that will sit in front of those trees so that the trees are kind of masked out. And then what I normally do whilst I'm working on the drawings, I right click and lock that so you can't notice that fill that's in front of the trees. And that's really important where layers become really key to managing your drawings and the hierarchy and the visibility of them. And I think the trees really bring this drawing to life once again, very similarly to how it does in the floor plan. In section and elevation, it shows that context, it shows the relationship between the landscape and where this building is situated. And likewise here in this section, you can see the clear two levels where before this was a slope that was gradually ramping up. You can now see that you've got this kind of integration at this upper point where people are looking out over the top of the landscape. So once again, as discussed in the mood board earlier on, I didn't want to design something that was going to disrupt the view across the landscape. And instead, when you're at the top here, you can still look out across over the city of London. But when you're at these lower points, you can look into the building and have these moments of looking into the activities. And so that is the sections and elevations. The project is finally coming to life. I feel like when you're working in floor plan for such a long period of time, obviously it doesn't necessarily translate fully into elevation, which is really important when you're kind of jumping between the two and you're working between the two. So when you're forming your geometry in the floor plan, you're also thinking about it in elevation and in 3 dimensions and how that associates with one another. And then the next step in the next lesson is going to be really critical to then start building into the style of these drawings. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you 3 different examples of drawing styles. I'm going to start applying some hatches and textures to indicate materiality. I'm going to add shadow to add real depth to the drawing, and that'll be really critical. But at the moment, this just shows you a really clear idea of how you can create your kind of baseline elevations and sections to then take it to the next level, to start working into them, into the graphic style and into the graphic communication and the detail you want to provide in your drawings. Thank you for watching this lesson, and I will see you in the next one.